want to start this video by telling you the story of how I came to love Star Wars. I had formed an early fascination with movies, and in my wide-eyed years, I loved virtually anything I saw on that big screen. But nothing could have prepared me for what I was about to experience. It was so larger than life and brimming with so much awe and wonder that my 7-year-old brain could hardly process what I had just seen, and I proceeded to beg my parents to take me several more times just to soak it all in. I fell in love with everything Star Wars: the lightsabers, the spaceships, all of the different planets and aliens. The action and the scope took my breath away, and I didn't even know how to explain it yet, but that music just stirred something in my soul. I cried when Qui-Gon died, Anakin was my hero, and I even loved Jar Jar. So you can imagine my excitement when I learned that, despite the title of the film, this was not actually the first Star Wars movie, but that there were 3 whole other movies that had already come out. I don't even remember how many times we rented the original trilogy, or how many times we watched it after buying the VHS box set, but the obsession was already growing when I discovered a whole other world. Video games like Rogue Squadron, Shadows of the Empire, TIE Fighter, The Masters of something that I never knew how to pronounce, novels in the expanded universe like The Paradise Snare or The Truce at Bakura, and I began consuming every piece of Star Wars content I could get my hands on, eagerly awaiting the release of episodes 2 and 3. And for years it was like this Star Wars paradise, the excitement waiting for new movies, with countless other books and games keeping us busy in the meantime, with a few in particular becoming some of my all-time favorite video games. It was becoming clear that Star Wars was just the single greatest franchise in all of entertainment, and the release of episodes 2 and 3, which I unambiguously loved with all my heart, just further cemented this feeling. Nowhere else could you find 6 incredible films, actually good video games, and a whole library of books that expanded this universe far beyond the scope of the movies. And then there were the comics, and the toys, and the Legos, and none of it felt like it was phoned in. In 2005, with the release of the final film in the prequel trilogy, it felt like we would inevitably watch that wave hit its crest and recede back out to sea. We always dreamed of Lucas returning to make his sequel trilogy. He'd spoken about the possibility for decades. The expanded universe even gave us a small glimpse of what that might someday be. But after the critical backlash to the prequels had everyone accusing George of ruining their childhood, it felt like we would never see the franchise return to the big screen. But then, a whisper of hope in the darkness.
I am proud to announce the Walt Disney Company is acquiring Lucasfilm and the home of the legendary Star Wars franchise.
The reason I wanted to tell you this story is because I wanted to adequately paint the picture for you of where my heart was at when Disney first announced their new plans for the franchise. I wasn't some cynical cinephile. I was a Star Wars obsessive who had loved virtually everything released under its banner. I welcomed with open arms the idea of other authors telling their own stories in this universe, even with the beloved characters of the original movies. And countless video games or novels proved that it could be done beautifully. So I was just as excited as every other Star Wars fan when Disney made their acquisition. But after several movies and TV shows that have ranged from mildly entertaining at best to completely bland or outright bad, I feel it's fair to say that Disney has shown a fundamental lack of understanding of what makes Star Wars special. There are a lot of things that can be said for what Disney has gotten wrong, plenty of which has already been said thousands of times over. So rather than focusing on the nuances of every project since Disney took over and discussing every single misstep, I wanted to offer a broader view of what I see as the fundamental problems with Disney's Star Wars. Everyone has their own subjective reasons for falling in love with these stories, and no two fans seem to be able to agree on what exactly makes something Star Wars. So I wanted to help settle this debate once and for all by going back to the film's origins. The The whole idea started after George Lucas failed to secure the rights to the story that he really wanted to tell, opting to tell a new story that could capture that same pulpy space opera feel of the comic serial, sorting through countless influences to help create his new world, looking at stories like Flash Gordon, but also the stories that inspired it too, the John Carter stories, which he traced back to Arthurian legends and beyond. He wanted to understand the roots of building a mythology, creating his own version of the hero's journey, looking to the teachings of Joseph Campbell, the works of Tolkien, other science fiction like Dune or the Foundation series, but also the pulp comics of his youth, from Buck Rogers to Marvel and DC.
I'd always wanted to take mythology and take the psychological underpinnings of and motifs of mythology from all around the world and boil it down into things that seem to resonate everywhere in the world. And I said I could take that concept of the psychological underpinnings of mythology, combine it with the exciting action-adventure of a Saturday matinee serial, and that would be kind of a cool movie.
And quickly, Star Wars was becoming this amalgamation of everything Lucas was passionate about. You can see countless cinematic influences from Kurosawa to Lang, Ford, and Leone that inspired major set pieces or character designs, wipe transitions, shot compositions. Lucas was a true cinephile, and he pulled inspiration from the best films of the time to elevate this campy space opera to a true work of art, bringing in his own real-world influences to give the film its own distinctive voice, from his love of cars and planes or his fascination with history. Samurais and monks, cowboys and pirates, medieval knights, World War II, Vietnam. He was borrowing from and paying tribute to so many different things that it shouldn't work, but somehow it does. There are elements of politics, philosophy and religion, war, crime, romance, adventure, horror, comedy, fantasy. Star Wars truly has a little bit of everything for everyone. All art is borrowing from something, and Lucas openly embraced that idea to use an ocean of influence to help build his universe. But it was this specific combination of influences that were unique to George that made Star Wars Star Wars. He chose to embrace everything that he loved and threw it all together into one planet-sized melting pot. That's what all good world builders do. They take advantage of their own individual experiences and the art or the history that inspired them the most. Lucas didn't work alone, but I firmly believe that no one does. And while he does owe a lot of the franchise's success to the countless artists working behind the frame, this was ultimately George's world, his imagination, and it was strange and campy, but it was also beautiful and could stir genuine emotion from its audience. It basically perfected the template for a crowd-pleasing blockbuster and became the highest-grossing film of all time as a result, as well as earning 10 Academy Award nominations, winning 6, and taking home an additional Special Achievement Award for its sound design. It's just a film with no true equal in so many ways, and The Empire Strikes Back is almost universally agreed to be even better. Not everyone loves Return of the Jedi or the prequels, but I personally feel that all 6 films in the original Skywalker saga are truly great. Flawed in places, but the ambition and originality was, and in many ways still is, unmatched. Which brings me to Disney. I'll admit I haven't watched everything they've done with Star Wars, but I've seen enough to have lost all hope. I'll give Andor a shot someday because I want to believe that the hype is deserved, but I've seen almost everything else, and after multiple movies and TV shows have left me feeling, at best, wildly entertained, or at worst, downright depressed, as a fan, my heart can only take so much. Star Wars was my first true love in cinema and storytelling in general, but Disney has consistently shown a lack of understanding or even basic respect for the franchise and its roots. George Lucas built his world through a tremendous wealth of historical knowledge. He used a well of literary influences to craft the characters and their arcs, and countless cinematic works inspired how he put it all together on the screen. But when we watch Disney's Star Wars, we see very little of that. Instead of borrowing from thousands of varying influences from art to history, it's mostly just borrowing from Star Wars itself, endlessly trying to capture its former glory, a fair amount of which just completely ignores the prequel trilogy altogether. Even in this infinite universe of possibility, everything either centers around characters that we already know and love, or new characters that are meant to mirror the characters we already know and love. They seem obsessed with leaving no stone unturned, trying to fill in every blank of storytelling that no one was even asking to be filled, all the while constantly changing their vision directly based on the feedback from the internet, rather than following any plan or proper story or character for that matter. There's no unifying vision, which was clearly evident in the sequel trilogy, but even in their other shows and movies, it feels like every project has struggled to find its identity. Rogue One is a big fan favorite, but I never loved it. I feel like it has some good action and cinematography, but not much else. Solo was a clear misstep and suffered from too many conflicting visions and changing hands, despite having a promising cast. Virtually no one enjoyed the Book of Boba Fett, and I know many, myself included, found it to be pretty unforgivable that they robbed The Mandalorian of a moment that never should have been in another series, leading into a third season that I feel we can all agree was a major step down in quality from the previous two. But Obi-Wan Kenobi was the worst for me yet, especially as such a fan of the prequels. Even the moment that everyone wanted to see, the final epic duel between Obi-Wan and Anakin, is an ugly mess of direction and choreography with such a dark and washed out look that it's hard to even see what's happening. I mean, compare this to this and tell me something hasn't gone terribly wrong. The reason why all 6 of the original films are miles better than anything in the Disney franchise is because they were all labors of love for Lucas. They took years of writing and planning and designing and filming. They were at the forefront of the technological limitations of the industry, pushing the entire industry forward by constantly doing things that had never been done before. The prequels may not be as loved as the original trilogy, but they still show that same love of history, the same love of film, and a love for these characters by allowing them to have agency beyond the small prism we viewed them through in the original trilogy, with countless new characters worth standing alongside the originals. And Lucas also built a world that was immediately different than what we had seen before. It's why the prequels feel distinctly Star Wars despite feeling and looking almost nothing like the original trilogy. But somehow, the Disney franchise can often capture the look but still feel so shallow. They've got the shell of something great without any substance beneath it. And the sad truth is that it was all doomed right from the start. To explain what I mean, I want to briefly discuss another franchise. The Lord of the Rings trilogy are like unicorn films, big budget, big spectacle, crowd-pleasing movies that also earned the highest praise from everyone in the industry. The Return of the King is still tied for first as the most decorated film in Oscar history, and the franchise is also one of the highest grossing ever made, spawning a new multimedia franchise that included merchandise and video games. Hopefully you're starting to see some parallels. But just like Star Wars, no one was initially clamoring to make these movies. It was a passion project that took years of fighting just to get the green light to enter production, and then 4 years of writing and storyboarding with some early visual effects tests to pull off the forced perspective or its ambitious CGI, followed by 15 months of shooting all 3 films simultaneously, with all of the remaining time between each film's release being used for important reshoots or improving the visual effects. By the time The Return of the King was released in 2003, these movies had been in production for 8 years, the culmination of thousands of people following a meticulous plan that had been thoroughly laid out. But then we look at The Hobbit, a trilogy Jackson never even intended to direct. By the time he had jumped on board this moving train when Guillermo del Toro dropped out, he was already staring down the barrel of a deadline. X amount of dollars had already been spent, Y amount of months already invested, and they needed to have something finished to release to the public. He had to rework scripts and redo previs and pre-production on this brand new trilogy that was never meant to be a trilogy, with only a fraction of the time to do it all. It's the same director, the same writers, the same composer, the same cinematographer, the same VFX team, with double the budget that The Lord of the Rings had. But I have yet to come across a single person that genuinely believes the Hobbit trilogy is better. So if the same talent working with more money and even the luxury of Tolkien's own words to adapt couldn't turn out something great under these conditions, what chance did Star Wars have? This is what happens when studio greed outweighs the intention to make good art. The sequel trilogy and everything else Disney has released in their new expanded universe was designed to mimic their other multi-billion-dollar franchise, because apparently it's not enough to just have one of those. These weren't films crafted with the same time and care as the rest of the Skywalker saga. They were made to come out at a specific time to coincide with the release of the other movies that were going to build to other TV shows that all connect with each other. Not to mention the video games and the toys and the Legos, and all of it had to happen in a very strict timeline in a very specific way, or it all falls apart. The individual stories never mattered. It was all about servicing the larger brand, building their Star Wars empire. And that's why they went full speed ahead on a trilogy with no plan figured out beforehand. Of course, George Lucas didn't exactly have a full vision laid out either. Vader and Anakin were originally two separate people, Luke and Leia didn't start out as siblings, and countless other changes were made in between movies. But not only is George the most well-equipped person as the creator of Star Wars to decide what to do with Star Wars, he also wrote the first movie without having any idea what the reaction would be. So instead of trying to plan out a whole trilogy, or saga for that matter, he made one great film to start and began thinking about the bigger picture when it was clear he'd actually be able to finish his story. But the changes that he made never broke what came before. Some things might raise some interesting questions, but others were crucial in providing a story arc for the trilogy.
No, I am your father.
While this might not have been his initial intention for the story, it's what gives the trilogy this emotional connective tissue. It was no longer just the story of Luke Skywalker fighting against the Empire with his rebel friends. It was the story of a father that fell into darkness, and the son who would help him to find the path to the light. And we can see evidence that changes were made in between films, but these scenes don't fall apart in hindsight. They carry a new meaning.
A young Jedi named Darth Vader helped the Empire hunt down and destroy the Jedi Knights. He betrayed and murdered your father.
The cynic might see lazy writing or early signs of Alzheimer's in Obi-Wan, but I see a broken man who will do anything to keep Luke from falling to the dark side like his father before him, even if that means lying to him. So it is retconning, but the rare kind that respects what came before and gives the story more emotional depth than what the initial story depicted. This one seed of inspiration changed the entire arc of the trilogy and gave way to the entire outline of the prequels, where we would now watch how Anakin became Darth Vader in the first place. There's a symmetry to it all, an arc that connects each 3 films within their respective trilogies, while also tying all 6 films together as the Skywalker saga. But Disney didn't have any story arc. They barely had a faint wisp of a concept for one movie before they dove straight into production on a trilogy. Unlike Lucas, they knew before ever writing a single word that this was going to be a big deal no matter what they made. So why didn't they take the time to properly plan? because they spent $4 billion in 2012 and were committed to having something in theaters for the 2015 holiday season. 3 years to build this new chapter of the most beloved movie franchise in the history of cinema. Peter Jackson had more time than that just to focus on writing the screenplays and doing some early pre-production for his trilogy, not to mention the fact that he had source material to adapt. This was going to be a brand new trilogy, stories we had never seen before, and even with zero plan, they made this official announcement of a trilogy immediately after buying Lucasfilm. They were racing towards a self-imposed deadline for the sake of having a successful brand launch that completely throttled every step of the filmmaking process as a result. It takes time to come up with ideas, a new story, new characters, and then it takes time to find the right people to play those roles, and then a crew who can bring it all to life through sets and costumes, all of the different aliens or robots, and then you still have to film the whole thing and edit it, and then do all of the other post-production work from sound to VFX. And it all needs to work in tandem with the 2 other episodes that will have to go through the exact same process. And because of this highly unrealistic deadline, they were writing all 3 chapters of this trilogy at the same time, with 3 different writers and directors who all had completely different visions and conflicting ideas about what Star Wars even is, trying to build out this larger story arc when pieces were being shifted up until the last minute on all 3 films. It's like I mentioned earlier, no 2 fans seem to be able to agree on what makes something Star Wars, so putting 3 of those fans in charge of writing a trilogy separately but at the same time, where everyone was also somehow apparently given full creative control, it was destined to be a complete mess of a story. But worse than just fumbling the ball this badly for the sequel trilogy, this retconning to shove Palpatine back into the story completely tarnishes the legacy of the original saga. It completely negates Anakin's redemption and his sacrifice. It nullifies the sacrifice of all of our heroes and everything they've fought for across 6 movies. Stealing this moment of triumphant victory to hand it off as a participation trophy for the new generation. And I'm genuinely worried if fans are okay with this. It is such a blatant slap in the face to a legacy that had already been beautifully laid to rest 30 years prior, exhumed and defiled with no regard for anything but profit. They knew they were being given an amazing opportunity to tell these stories in the first place, to have the privilege of working with these actors again, with John Williams again, was actually a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. But even though they were already the richest company in the world of entertainment, they rushed out a half-baked story that they never properly figured out even as they were releasing movies. It's why almost no character has any sort of arc, why there's no proper connective tissue between the films on an emotional level, or even a logical one at times.
Somehow Palpatine returned.
And why reception to each film got worse as it went along, because these flaws only become more apparent the further you get into a story. But this is why I can't find myself caring about anything they do with Star Wars. If this was the level of respect given to the foundation of the franchise and all of these legacy cast and crew, it doesn't bode well for anything else in the Disney Star Wars universe. I know making movies isn't easy. Making something with this many fans in a way that everyone would enjoy is clearly impossible. But to rush out a trilogy that was never planned, that simultaneously exploits our nostalgia while also undermining the very legacy it's built upon, is genuinely one of the most greedy things I've ever seen in entertainment. And what is their plan moving forward? Clearly, even they don't know. Everything they do is just a reaction to the online reaction. The internet hates this character? Don't worry. They're gone. People are loving this new show? Well, let's stretch it out for as long as possible and even make a few spin-offs. If you're someone that just loves Star Wars and everything in that world, if you've loved this new era, I'm not trying to spoil that for you or judge you for it. Even I've enjoyed parts of it. But can you honestly tell yourself after everything we've seen that we didn't deserve more? You can watch any of the 6 previous films and they still stir our emotions, captivate our imagination. You might cringe at the dialogue, but I know no one is cringing when Lucas is at his best. No one directs action quite like he does, delivering these sequences of visual poetry between the space battles or the lightsaber duels. Watching these scenes now still hits me as hard as they did when I was a kid, and in ways that few movies have been able to rival ever since. But a few rare moments aside, almost everything in this Disney franchise just rinses away with the next cycle. And one of the most frustrating things about all of this is that they didn't have to walk that path blind. There were books that filled in gaps between the movies, video games that explored entirely new eras of Star Wars, but Disney decided to disown everything except for the 6 movies and the Clone Wars, and then even canceled other projects that were currently in development. And for what? Dozens of stories that fans loved thrown into the trash and replaced with this assembly line storytelling that they still haven't figured out after 10 years. The truth is that Star Wars is not a legacy to Disney. It's a business that they invested $4 billion in. But movies are not meant to be made as these gigantic billion-dollar multimedia franchises. Star Wars is a film, not a McDonald's. Lucas just wanted to tell a pulpy space story about a plucky kid with magical powers, within a world that could encompass everything he was passionate about: technology, philosophy, politics, even down to simple joys like wanting to go fast, and everything in between. There's a depth hiding under the simplicity of Star Wars, and that is always what gave it its magic. They're cheesy kids movies that are fun for the whole family, but can also carry a much deeper meaning for those willing to engage with it beyond just lightsabers and spaceships. And you may not love every choice that Lucas made, but he at least was focused on telling great stories while delivering the best spectacle that you could find. And Disney clearly isn't doing either of those. Star Wars, like Marvel, and now even their own beloved animated classics, have been sucked up by the Disney vacuum, repackaging our youth in the most soulless way possible, with no care for legacy or storytelling, no care for filmmaking, with no respect for the artists or for the audience, and where nothing is sacred but the almighty dollar. And some defend it because they're just grateful to see more Star Wars. But as a fan who did a lot more than just watch the movies, I can promise you that Star Wars was doing just fine until Disney came along. And ever since their takeover, it has literally never been worse. Even the video games suck now, because Disney found their soulmate in EA, and I don't know how that didn't seal the deal right then and there. There was once a time when nearly everything Star Wars related was a love letter to cinema, to literature, fantasy, science fiction, history. Lucas was an innovator that pushed visual effects forward, that pushed sound design forward, helping to build tools that are used by the rest of the industry to this day. And despite not always telling stories that the fans universally loved, he stayed true to his passions and told the stories that he wanted to tell. And the countless voices that carried this legacy in his wake gave it that same level of respect. But now it's all being run like clickbait content on a bad YouTube channel, using familiar faces and the iconography of Star Wars past to hide the fact that they have no idea what they're doing even a decade after acquiring the rights. The depressing thing is that there are plenty of artists who could do these stories justice. I think plenty have already been involved, but as long as Disney keeps forcing everything down the content pipeline, none of these artists or writers or actors will ever be able to do their best work. This model for production can and does lead to the occasional worthwhile moment, but they are too far and few between for an intellectual property that has this much to offer across so many different mediums. Star Wars is an infinite sandbox to explore, and it shouldn't be this hard to make something amazing. to find those that have a deep love of Star Wars beyond just the original trilogy, but also people who are curious and knowledgeable about as many things as Lucas was, so it can be infused with all of that beautiful inspiration again. And most importantly, they just need to be given the time and the tools to do the work. Not to always be rushed through the writing or the directing or the VFX that some random guy on YouTube can improve in just a few hours. It's why I commend those who save their harshest criticism for the company and not the artists. Everyone who hates J.J. Abrams now or thinks that Rian Johnson is an idiot hack are just missing the point and blaming all of the wrong people. What was either supposed to do? Again, look at The Lord of the Rings compared to The Hobbit. The same people made both of these trilogies, but under wildly different circumstances. And if that isn't clear proof that there's something wrong with the modern studio system, I don't know what is. And I really don't know what else to say. As a diehard Star Wars fan, it all just hurts. It has the most potential of any cinematic universe, but Disney seems completely uninterested in even trying. No one is forcing them to make this many projects. No one is forcing them to make them so fast. This whole assembly line production cycle is their own doing. At least a bad clickbait channel on YouTube has the excuse of needing to pay rent, but Disney rakes in billions of dollars every year regardless of what's happening with Star Wars, and it shows a complete disregard for how important these stories are to so many people all over the world. You know, the fans that have consumed enough Star Wars to make that $4 billion investment look like a bargain in hindsight. But the hardest part is seeing the undying love of so many fans who continue to support everything Disney does. Because I truly believe that somewhere deep down, we all know that everything could have been so much better. Maybe you've loved most of it, maybe you've loved all of it, but that's why I wanted to highlight everything behind the scenes. Because even if you're a ride or die that is loving every moment of this new era, there's just no disputing that Disney has been reckless. If they started focusing on telling meaningful stories again and not just regurgitating nostalgia, if they focused on creating thought-provoking art that also carries genuine big screen spectacle, I think we could easily find ourselves in another beautiful era for Star Wars. With all the talent in the world of filmmaking, the money that Disney can sink into these projects, and the potential of all that Star Wars has to offer, there's no reason for it to be this way. Thank you guys for watching, and I'll see you next time.